Welcome to this brand workshop. I just need to see if, yes, this is working. Oh, wow. No, it's not working. I need to actually click my screen to progress. So that should be fun. Any technical difficulties always happens. But welcome to the this little brand workshop that I'm doing with Chris for Right Aligned. As Chris said, I run a little studio called Hello Muller. I'm an independent designer and creative director, and I'm kind of best known for my work in the entertainment industry. So I specialize in branding and visual identity, and I work primarily with publishers, content creators, storytellers, game companies, film studios, TV studios, all that kind of stuff, using branding and design build to help people build their stories, build tech startups that are looking to launch their services, video games, video game developers, publishers that want to create new stories, new IP. They bring me in to kind of use branding as a tool to build their stories and connect to their audiences. And over the years, I've kind of tried to formalize this into something that I like to call designing fiction and branding stories, which is basically doing just that, like taking fictional ideas, formalizing them, building them into like kind of brand worlds for people to enjoy, and kind of use design as a subset of a wider like language in storytelling. And so for this kind of session, we're going to look at one of those projects, which is the branding for iHeart Comics. iHeart Comics is I'm just going to play a little clip. I hope that plays well over streaming. My internet can sometimes be a bit temperamental, but so iHeart Comics is a content creation studio, a marketing agency, a record label, all bunch of creative things based in LA. Was started 20 years ago by a guy called Frankie Chan, who is an artist, DJ, producer, and started out doing basically DJ nights in LA and slowly built up a community of creatives around him. And that eventually became iHeart Comics as it is known now. And they specialize in creating these immersive events for film premieres, record label launches, album launches, creating original content for Amazon, for example, like short form storytelling, long form storytelling, all these kind of things. And over the years, they've become like quite successful in doing that, and they kind of build up a reputation and a kind of name for themselves as a creative studio that does things slightly differently compared to the kind of like industry competitors, what have you. So you can see here you've got Frankie, and in the bottom right corner you got him and his core team at iHeart Comics. And so Frankie kind of came to me, I think the tail end of 2022, start of 2023. I think it's closer to 2022. Basically saying like, look, we've been around for a while. We have a kind of like, we have an identity. That identity has worked well for us, but we're kind of looking ahead at our 20th anniversary. That's going to happen in 2024. So we kind of want to grow as the company is growing. We want to grow our identity as well, our voice, how we kind of present ourselves to potential clients, to the industry, to fans. And so this is a mix of like the identity that they had. You can already see that it's a bit playful, it's a bit funky, it's quite like loud in a good way, I think. And they're very, very much like really intertwined in like the whole pop culture kind of scene, music industry, film industry, TV, entertainment, that kind of stuff. And they still have, it is in the name of the company. There is still that kind of love for comic books, pop culture, like art, illustration. And so it was about like taking that identity and thinking about how can we evolve that rather than, as you'll see as in the next couple of slides, they wanted to more evolve the brand than just wiping everything away, because they had built over, all these years, they had built equity and kind of a sense of brand recognition and the values of what they stand for. And the really interesting thing was that when we started working together, like Frankie had already done a lot of homework, and I don't really get a lot of clients that approach me with mood boards and already kind of filtering through ideas. And I think that's kind of like the bonus of working with clients that are in the creative industry as well. Like they have a good idea of what they want, and then it's my job to kind of start challenging and pushing back where it needs to be pushed back, seeing where things gel. And the really nice thing was when he sent over his kind of mood boards that I'm showing here, is that there were a few bits of my own work in there already. So I think we pretty early on established a really good working relationship in terms of like, we're speaking the same language, we know, we have a good feeling of like what direction we want to go in, what we kind of like and what we don't like. And with all that in mind, and kind of like, we go through the whole kind of set of, what do you need, when do you need it by. I sent a quote that was way too expensive, so we kind of trimmed down, where we trimmed the fat of like, what do you really need and what's a nice to have. And so we kind of like, went through a bit of a process to establish what the actual needs were versus what the nice to haves were. And then we went into what I usually do, and this is nothing new. I'm not reinventing the wheel here, but my discovery phase is basically, here's my mood boards. I've got like a massive amount of references that I've collected over the years, and I always like to kind of respond to a client's kind of mood board and their likes with something that I think is cool. And it's a mix, like, this is all found imagery, and there's new stuff, there's old stuff, there's vintage stuff, there's stuff that was just posted online last week from some agency that I like. And it's just, for me, it's not necessarily about showing them like this is what the design is going to be, but it's more about, I like this vibe, do you like this vibe? Maybe we can work in that kind of like, clean typography, something modern mixed with something old, like bright colors, etc., etc. And then we kind of started to analyze what the actual flow of the work would be. So this was the previous branding that they had, like the IHC speech bubble and like the IHC kind of long word mark. And as I said before, it was really important for them to kind of keep that recognition of that visual brand, because it speaks to a lot of things for them in the name. The speech bubble obviously is like almost like a totemistic item in comic books. So that's already like a part of the name that's quite important. But it also, like, to me, it starts to reflect things like, you're speaking to people, you're broadcasting, you want to say something, you have a voice. So with that in mind, I started to do like, I always do initial sketches, like pen and paper. I mean, I've been doing this for like more than 26 years now. I grew up and like when I studied, it was all about like doing everything manually. And I still like the speed and the ease of just like noodling around. I still do this, like, when I leave the house, I'm usually, I either go to a cafe or like late at night, like I might go for, a drink, and I always have my notepad with me and I'm just noodling and thinking about stuff. So these initial sketches were me just kind of like touchy-feely exploring the kind of the boundaries of what I can do. And is there a way of like keeping the IHC speech bubble, do something nice? Does the C become the speech bubble? Is there a way to incorporate a heart? Does it become a play button? Those kind of things is all kind of interesting for me to just kind of quickly establish a bit of a thought pattern and thinking, okay, this is, is there a way to make like a really nice intricate monogram, those kind of things. And that kind of usually takes a week, couple of days to just kind of get my head around like what the actual kind of lay of the land is going to be. And then we started to go like, then it gets formalized into like design rounds, and I think in total, as you'll see, I think we had like 4 or 5 rounds in all in kind of refining and like tightening everything up. So the first one I went in with 4 concepts, all kind of based around that idea of evolving that speech bubble and the IHC mark. So initially my thought was like, maybe I've lived in England too long, but I thought like, yeah, a signet ring, kind of like you can stamp your mark on the work, and you kind of like stamp on like, you know, your voice on the work, kind of creating like a kind of more modern, like, but still rounded um look and feel for the new brand, like clean typography, like going for like a fresh color palette. Second one was a more modern approach to the kind of speech bubble, very rigid, very clean, very minimal, a bit more geometric, very serious, a more muted color palette. Always trying to look at like, you know, what kind of pattern can I create from the lockups, and then kind of playing with the rhythm in the type. Is there a way to like simplify the IHC into something that's really geometric, almost abstract, combined with the long form word mark? You know, just kind of testing a few different routes and a few different approaches, from being something that's a bit more literal to going like a bit more abstract, you know, cool, make it like very like, you know, serious and a bit mysterious maybe. And kind of thinking maybe there's a way in doing something really abstract like here, where like, you know, the I, H, and C, playing with the negative space, kind of filling out the glyphs to come up with like, you know, it doesn't really need to be legible. Maybe we can, you know, the idea is always like maybe it can become like a Nike where the swoosh represents everything, and we can work towards like, you know, just a geometric kind of thing, and then educate the people along the way that I Heart Comics is, you know, dash dot dash something like that. But nothing really stuck in round one. So round two is kind of like, yeah, cool, but let's focus on these two. These two were like, you know, the strongest contenders, and kind of still, you know, visibly for Frankie and the team, there was a through line. They could kind of recognize where they were and where I was kind of trying to lead them. And as I'm talking, you'll probably notice that I'm saying we a lot, because, you know, even though I work for myself, I'm like, you know, I'm kind of like a one man band agency, but I always like working really closely with my clients, and especially when they're fellow creatives, you're kind of shooting stuff back and forth. Like, you know, we had like a little Slack group going on, so it's really easy, especially with them being on the West Coast, based in LA. There's a bit of a time difference, but it's really easy to just go like, you know, there's always a few hours a day where we overlap, just shoot things back and forth, make notes, noodle, that kind of stuff. Um, so this kind of like the ring idea started to slowly evolve into more and more of a speech bubble. I still was playing around, like I really wanted to make that kind of modern, rigid kind of sigil geometric ring idea work, but then start to pair it like, you know, thinking about like fresh color palettes, like do something contrasty with like, you know, the shape versus the colors. And I'm a really big fan of, and I'm sure other designers and creatives do this as well, like you're a fan of a type foundry and you have favorite typefaces, and then you go like, where can I use this typeface, where can I use the work of this foundry in my work? And so I thought, obviously the type family from Oh No Type Company really fitted with the kind of the energy and the vibe that kind of comes from I Heart Comics. It's serious, but it has like a twinkle in its eye. It's got a playfulness, but it's still like formal enough and varied enough to give different character to the messaging that they want to do. So with all that in mind, like, you know, I'm kind of like jumping back and forth between exploring some type, exploring how the color families can work, how it can work when we start like, you know, locking up the word mark with the logo mark. And then I started landing on the idea of maybe it's not a ring, but the speech bubble can have the tail reintroduced. But it's not a traditional speech bubble. It has like, it's a bit taller to make it look a bit different, but we're bringing back in that kind of the tail to indicate that they're talking, they are speaking to the audience, to the fans. And then that speech bubble could maybe become like a bit of a modular thing, and then we can kind of add it in different angles. maybe it can have different expressions. And as we were doing these kind of explorations, one thing that kind of got stuck into our head, and which, as we'll see in a few slides down, kind of became the idea of going back to, because they work a lot in, like, broadcast, film, TV, was to kind of look back at, say, vintage broadcast graphics from the 70s and the 80s, the kind of like, CBS, NBC, the work of Saul Bass, Lou Dorfman, that kind of, the warm colors, the layering, the overlapping of like signals and messaging, and maybe we can use like the different executions of the speech bubble and the ring shape to create, like, maybe start developing like the visual language that is not just separate elements, but they can kind of start interacting with each other. Maybe we can, the interplay with the color and the overlap was something that we started to like kind of like, and could be something that we can come back to at a later point, still playing with different shapes and different kind of thought, like kind of different speech bubbles. And I was always kind of going, like, I was really trying hard to make it look not like a comic book thing, but still comic booky enough, but cool. Because, there was this thing like, people know that I do a lot of work in comics, but I don't want to make this look like a comic booky thing. It's like, it's a creative agency, it's a content studio. So kind of exploring those things. And especially with like the modern type wedged in it, it was going to look different anyway. Some more color explorations, trying to see how the type would start interact with the logo. And I think that was the first, that used to be their tagline, like connecting music and geek culture. And see how that would kind of, that was a synthesis of what they do, see how that works with the typeface, how that could then work with like, their projects and case studies and like the people that they work with, and how all these elements like slowly, I mean, this is only round 2, and I'm just gently trying to see how these things can fit. Is there like a nice way to combine these things? How flexible is this going to be? The usual merch mock-ups, just to kind of like touch that kind of checkbox, just to kind of, give an idea of what it could look like. Then the second speech idea, kind of the same thing, make it like simplify it, but it was kind of, as you'll see, this is very kind of very serious, very dry, very business-like a much darker and muted color palette. But I kind of landed on using the Founders Grotesque family from Klim, another one of my kind of workhorse typefaces. And I thought this kind of works with this route. And actually, when I started to like use it as a type application, there was something really nice and really bold. And even though it's quite like, it's much more, it feels much more structured than, say, obviously it's got less, it doesn't have the flares going on. It's like, nice and condensed and solid, but it still has enough of a punch to like connect with the kind of pop culture aesthetic and kind of language that we're trying to build. And then I wanted to use that kind of speech bubble as a kind of like, maybe it becomes like a ring, it becomes a frame to like hold the content. And again, each kind of route, I try to do like some quick mock-up applications to see where that lands, which was kind of leading us into like, okay, we're getting somewhere. It's not there yet, but definitely this became the contender. This kind of speech bubble idea, like the ring. I mean, we're still calling it a ring in like, in my presentations, but it had become the bubble. But the thing was that this kind of type treatment, it didn't really work. Like, we went back and forth, and I really tried my best to kind of go like, no, it needs to be modern and like a bit abstract. But in the end, it makes sense actually. Like, I think generally speaking, like as a designer, I always, and we as designers, you always want to push your view and like, no, I know best. It's my job to know these things. It's my specialty and everything. But they came from a viewpoint that, you know, it has to be legible and it has to be recognizable. Like they have been IHC for so many years. Changing it up too much now would be a step too soon and too far for what it needed to be. So we kind of started to step back and see like, okay, if we go with IHC, do we do it like very rigidly, like in the first kind of row? Do we kind of keep the geometric shape? But it actually didn't really, you know, that kind of lockup completely failed because like the kind of warm curvature of the speech bubble with the hard edged type, it just broke the thing. So kind of started to edge towards the right, where I started to use obviously as the core type for the IHC and kind of like the logo, refining color still, refining the word mark. I think we kind of all liked obviously as the kind of the type choice for the logo and the word mark. More colors, you know, still Founders Grotesque kind of became the favorite for the kind of like the type, the brand type, as we started to evolve it. I had another go at the kind of the speech bubble geometrically, trying to clean it up a bit more, formalizing the frame, but it didn't really land, except for that we all really liked how Founders Grotesque sat with the messaging and the color and the type, but not just with that logo, which led us to round 4, where we went like, okay, I think we're there, we're almost there. We got the logo, we like that speech bubble, we like that it says IHC. So how about we take the logo and we take that speech bubble? It didn't really work too well in this shape because behind the scenes we started kind of testing it on like, you know, presentation decks. Does it work? How does it sit on social? How does it sit on an avatar? And then the solution was to condense it and bring it back a little bit into like the territory of a more recognizable speech bubble shape, punch the colors up a little bit more, make it a bit more vibrant, and then use those 3 core colors to build a kind of like a whole color system and like a family of colors that they can kind of use within their identity. The important thing was that, you know, we wanted to keep it like quite bright and colorful. So we landed on like the core blue and reds. We've got like 2 blues and a red, but we really wanted to avoid to make it look like an American flag. So there was a bit of pushing back and forth to make sure that whatever combinations we used, it wouldn't read out like we're IHC and we're from the States. We wanted to like, you know, we pushed that kind of away. And then we landed on like the logo using, I think it was obviously condensed. I kind of tweaked the C, kind of like the angles to give it a little bit of a custom, like a custom treatment in a kind of ownable shape. And for the word mark, the same thing, kind of like a slightly bigger weight. And even though like the agency uses, like they're basically known as IHC and they have like the speech bubble mark as their core brand asset, they still needed to have like a long form word mark, which is this what you see here. And then we, you know, it was a pretty easy decision at that point to use Founders Grotesque as the core brand typeface. But we needed to have a separate secondary type family, because as part of like the toolkit and the way that they operate is they built their whole kind of like brand, like their comms system on Google Slides. So we kind of had to work around and find a secondary font that would work in their kind of presentation suite and in their tools, because as IHC is actually quite a small agency, like they've got a small core agency, they do bring in a lot of specialists and external partners, especially when they're like, you know, building events, setting up like, say, you know, movie premieres or movie launches. they need to have like a kind of like a globalized set of tools. So they use the Google Suite. So hence a kind of like a separate kind of set of type families to kind of work with that. And with all these things kind of slowly being ticked off and falling into place as the kind of like as the puzzle is being completed, I could start to look at like, you know, how do we bring these colors together, and how does this actually start to become an actual living visual identity, and how does the agency and the studio represent itself, and how do they speak to fans, clients, collaborators, and bringing that kind of, you know, that layering, kind of shape layering that we kind of like touched early on, how to start to bring that into like a more formalized visual language and actually a brand system, which brings us into the final round where it was really like, okay, we've got everything, we've got like got all the ingredients, we know what we're doing, and now it's really about taking every single element and refine it, define every single bit, and like, you know, really tightening all the screws and making it really work as hard as it can, which meant also kind of simplifying the colorways for the logo. So we decided, especially looking at the ways that the logo would be applied and how it would live with in different channels and different situations and with different partners, to just keep it clean, keep it white on the core red color. And then we started to basically do all the traditional things that you do when you create a brand. Is like, you know, you do the scales. We formalized the graphics, and to really kind of use the brand colors to come up and set in. Basically, I created like a whole toolkit of graphic assets and how they could then be used and combined. And those core graphic expressions of the brand then became a really core part of the identity and how iHeart Comics would present themselves and speak to their clients. So we kind of landed on like the three core pillars of the core industries and activities that they're active in. So that's music, entertainment, and lifestyle. So each kind of graphic element and graphic toolkit kind of represents the kind of speaking to people, broadcasting to people, and like sending signals to people in these different brackets. And then like, you know, using those core brand elements and that kind of static imagery, but create a sense of motion and movement. And that became kind of, you know, as I'll show in a bit, to kind of use those kind of shapes as a direction to then start to bring these things into animation and bring these things to life, which became the overall identity. And this was kind of like, you know, the one of the core deliverables that I had to give to them, was basically formalized in a quite extensive guidelines document. And I think these are always really fun to create. Like once you've got everything, kind of you work out the logic, and it's a good way, like in these screens are really easy to just like kind of show and give people an immediate overview of what the brand looks like and all the different things that come to pass. So the tagline was condensed into just connecting culture, which also became like a custom mark. The typeface, the type families, and as a brand, they do actually a lot of outreach, and part of their identity is actually a living and a breathing thing through the events that they organize, through like, you know, Frankie still very actively being involved in the culture scene in LA. Like he's still actively DJing, throwing events, kind of networking with people. But that also translates in a lot of kind of social engagement online. So they do a lot of outreach digitally across like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Vimeo, Spotify. So the brand really needed to work in all those kind of like situations. This is always my favorite slide in any kind of guidelines document I do, which is how to not use it. And you kind of like just mess around with your own work and make it as ugly as possible, and then go like, no, not like that, but like this. This is kind of like just an overview of like all the different kind of touch points. They do a lot of outreach to clients, and so they needed a lot of robust presentation decks and kind of a brand and a brand language that could extend to like case studies, to emails. They're very actively on email, actually, like not just as an agency sending out emails to update people on the work and like what they're doing, but they're also very active in kind of content creation and content curation. So they act as kind of tastemakers in the industry, and to like, their networks of friends, family, clients, collaborators. So all that needed elements and aspects of the brand to give them the tools to speak to people in a very consistent visual voice, at least. And as I said at the beginning, this year is their 20th anniversary. So as a tail end of the project, there was like a little extra thing thrown in to create a custom mark for this year that they're actively using throughout all their comms to celebrate their 20 years in the business. And that basically, comes to the point where it became important to like bring the whole the identity to life. So we worked with an animation studio called Vandivision, who iHeart Comics and Frankie have worked with before on different projects. So they were kind of like the obvious choice and partner to work with us. They understand. They were immediately like clear on the vibe and the kind of the intention of what the brand needed to be and how that would be brought to life as an animation. So all these graphics that I'm showing you now are kind of like the touch points, like the ends, the kind of like the brand moments on show reels, on marketing collateral, on social, to kind of bring the IHC world to life, which is kind of touches all these different aspects. Like, it's kind of like, the content studio, the creative agency that sends out case studies and pitch decks and presentations and talks about the work they do, that's active on social. So they need all these different executions and expressions of how the brand comes alive on, like, how they speak to everyone, which is basically like, as well in a static way as in an animated way. So, on the left is like the content that they share on their socials to announce their weekly playlists. But then in Spotify, for example, it looks, it's a static asset. So it's just kind of like playing around and building that world out in like all these different ways. And I think their Instagram account is a really good kind of condensed version of how that world comes alive with, all their content and the world and the adventures that they kind of go on, and the things that they post and the people that they meet and their friends and their collaborators. And then you see their new brand kind of interspersed as kind of these really bright blocks and plops of color to kind of tie everything together within that world and gives them that kind of authoritative voice. And of course, every brand relaunch has to have merch. So at the start, we're 2024 now. So I think at the start of last year was when the brand was launched. So they created this kind of like IHC pizza box, which had merch and kind of messaging and kind of announcement things in there that was sent to like the friends and family and partners of IHC, which is always fun to do, and it's always fun to see your logo on a tote bag for real, rather than the mock-up. So yeah, that's kind of the adventures that we've been on. Like the project actually took on and off almost a year, because it was a very kind of fluid experience. We were kind of dipping in and out, letting things sit, kind of working on like ideas. And I think it was actually a really nice way of collaborating with fellow creatives who were really open to that kind of going back and forth and kind of arguing for and against certain things. But yeah, this is the I Heart Comics brand. They're celebrating. Well, we're almost halfway through 2024, so they're really celebrating their 20th anniversary hard and doing like they keep doing cool stuff. They keep doing like engaging with people in very interesting ways, and that's it.